Welcome to our attendees to this webinar on early psychosis intervention in Wyoming. My name is Jenny Allen. I'm with WICHE, and I am excited and honored to introduce this webinar to you. I am here on behalf of Dennis Mohat, who is our VP in our mental health program at WICHE. And so a little bit about us. We are a interstate compact with 16 states and territories in the western United States. And the WICHE mission is to provide access to higher education to create a better workforce, and we do that through collaboration with our member states. The mission of the mental health group is twofold: to help these states improve their systems of care for mental health consumers and their families in order to advance the preparation of a qualified mental health workforce. We collaborate with these states to meet the challenges of changing environments through regional research and evaluation. And the presentation we're going to show you is a perfect example of that collaboration. We are working with Ari Garcia in Wyoming Department of Health, and our presenters are from ESA in Portland State University, which is one of our WICHE institutions. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Ari Garcia. She is the state planner for the Wyoming Department of Health, and Maggie Lochley, who is the Quality Management and Outcomes Unit Manager. So, Ari, over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us on the webinar. Here in the division, we received a mental health block grant funding, and part of that funding is the 5% set-aside, which is required in the grant, and that funding has been used actually to pay for the series of webinars that we're going to see this month, and then also for the current year, we're going to, you may have seen an email come out about a smaller grant opportunity that can be applied for through the state treatment funding applications. And that money can be used to provide outreach and also to complement some of the elements of a first episode psychosis treatment program. And so we're really excited about that and to be working on that. And I think I'll turn it over to Maggie to talk about other information about that as well.
Thank you, Ari. We would just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for making the time and effort to become more informed regarding first episode psychosis. It's our privilege after many months of planning and preparation to actually get these webinars rolling. So we're looking forward to that. As Ari had mentioned earlier about a small grant opportunity that is available through your treatment contract or treatment applications, at this point in time, we're looking at the opportunity to provide funding to just one provider. However, this is a very important issue that needs to be more aggressively addressed, and so we're hoping that at some point that funding may increase over time, at least to some degree. And so, you know, we're very appreciative of WICHE's efforts and the collaboration that they have with ESA. They really are outstanding presenters that we have brought to you today, and it's, the dynamic duo of Tamara and Ryan, and so we're happy to turn the time over to them to kickstart this, and we look forward to having you all join us over the next couple of weeks to expand your skills and information regarding first episode. So take it away, Tamara.
Okay, great. Thanks. So we're a small group on the call. So we'll ask everybody to introduce themselves after we get through here.
I'm Ryan Melton. I'm the Clinical Training Director for the ESA Center for Excellence, so my role is to provide kind of the clinical oversight to all the ESA programs in the state of Oregon at the clinical level. So provide clinical trainings, provide fidelity reviews, provide consultation support, things like that for those programs. So Tamara gets them going, and I kind of work on the clinical side of things. Okay. So ESA started. ESA, actually, I should probably say what it stands for. It's the Early Assessment and Support Alliance. We started in 2001 with a very small mental health initiative in the with our coordinated care organization, our mental health organization, the Mid-Valley Behavioral Care Network. That was located. That particular organization covered 5 counties in the center of Oregon, kind of what we call the Mid-Valley. Okay, so the Mid-Valley Behavioral Care Network became somewhat frustrated with the reoccurring cycle of young people who were developing psychotic disorders, particularly those related to schizophrenia, who would go into the hospital and then circle right back out of the hospital, then come right back in, and there was no, they were having a difficult time stopping that cycle, resulting in, of course, significant financial cost as well as just cost of lives in terms of people losing functioning, and of course, trauma and disenfranchisement and challenges with the family. So they at one point hired a researcher to kind of look at ways to address this, and located the Early Psychosis Prevention and Intervention Center in Melbourne, Australia. And so from there, we took some of their guidelines, took some of their handbooks, and kicked off at what we called a pilot project at that point. To try to intervene with first episode schizophrenia to see what we could do to try to prevent this cycle. That was kind of our original start. All yours, Tamara.
Okay, thanks. So we've kind of we started without a lot of guidance and kind of added over time. And in 2007. Our legislature decided to start funding a statewide expansion, and that continues to grow. So we're at a point now where over 94% of the population has a local early psychosis team available, and we're working with other states to try to help them kind of figure out how to follow along a similar path. We created the ESA Center for Excellence in 2013 at Portland State University to try to kind of bring it to a different level in terms of research and to make sure that the ongoing training and consultation, fidelity review, that sort of thing was easily available to folks. So today we're going to talk about Wyoming specifically, and we're going to talk about kind of what we see happening today, what the impact is, some of the solutions that may be available through early psychosis intervention. And we're going to try to really think about what you guys have available where you might be able to actually implement some changes early on without a lot of additional funding, but then also thinking in the long term about funding strategies. This is part of a 4-webinar series, and what we're hoping is that it can be kind of interactive and that we can get to know each other a little bit as we walk through this, and we can tailor this to your specific needs. So at this point, the next webinar is going to be really focusing on kind of early signs and symptoms of psychosis, a little bit about differential diagnosis, a little bit about engagement, and then we'll go on and talk about what are the evidence-based practices, how can you begin to adapt those even today,
And then finally, in the last discussion, we really wanted to focus in on Wyoming specifically and talk about how can you kind of get to that next level, given the strengths and the challenges that you're experiencing. So I think at this point, what I'd like to do is just to have folks on the line introduce yourselves. So if you are muted, that'll mean that you'll need to unmute yourself before you speak, as we just experienced a moment ago. So maybe if you could just share your name, where you're from in terms of the town and the organization, and what role you play. And also if you have any specific questions, because we are a small group today, and so I think we have enough time to do that. So why don't we just start to try to be a little bit organized about it, and maybe go around start with like the northeast part of the state and work our way down and around and back into the central part. So do we have anybody from the northeast? Okay. Anybody from the eastern side of the state and the southern?
This is Dr. Sandy Jensen. I'm the psychologist with the Behavioral Health Division in Cheyenne.
Great. Wonderful. Anybody else from the Cheyenne area? Okay. How about the western side of the state?
This is Patty Cobb. I'm from Solutions for Life in Douglas, Wyoming. I am the administrative specialist sitting in for Peggy Hayes, our executive director today.
Okay, great. Welcome. Okay, how about the northern part, like northwest or central?
Hi, this is Rob Johnston. I'm in Casper. I chair the Governor's Behavioral Health Advisory Council.
Great. Okay. Who else is on the line? Okay, so it's definitely a small group today, and that's not a bad thing. We definitely were a small group when we started. And so one of the things that you all can do for us is to think about who's not on the line, who maybe should be, or who could be engaged in the conversation to help move things forward. And like I said, we'll have time for questions and answers when we get to the end, and as well as a discussion. So Ryan?
Of course. Yeah, so I think, obviously what we're talking about intervening early with here is psychosis. I'm guessing the people on the line are familiar with what psychosis is, Jen, and one thing that early psychosis programs will ultimately need to decide is with criteria which specific forms of psychosis they will be targeting in their programs. For example, in Oregon and at ESA sites, we certainly target the schizophrenia-related psychosis and bipolar 1 with psychotic disorders, specifically those who experience psychotic mania. We also intervene early with people who would be experiencing what we call psychosis with syndrome, or what they used to refer to as prodromal schizophrenia. I assume people know what psychosis is, but psychosis is again that, and its truest form is the ability to discern from what is real and what is not. And it obviously can have devastating consequences if we don't intervene early. The idea with programs like this, we treat psychosis like any other medical condition. And if you catch it early, your outcomes are good. If you catch it later, maybe your outcomes it becomes more challenging to do. You catch cancer in stage 1, almost everybody lives. You catch cancer in stage 4, unfortunately the outcomes are not as good. And the same thing can be true with schizophrenia. The longer the psychosis goes, the more challenging it can be. That's one of your basic goals of an early psychosis program.
So when we talk about how common psychosis is, this is one of our most important messages. Psychosis is one of the most common adolescent health conditions. And if you look at the statistics in the state of Wyoming, you can expect about 3 new people every week to develop a psychosis for the very first time. And about 1 out of 10,000 of those will have schizophrenia. So obviously psychosis covers a broader spectrum than just schizophrenia, And that is a big part of what early psychosis programs do, is to try to differentiate the causes and the appropriate treatment. And of course, we know that there are over 4,000 people in Wyoming who will experience schizophrenia, and if you include psychosis more generally, that's a much larger figure. The figure that the National Institute of Mental Health talks about nationally is about 100,000 new people per year developing psychosis, and that's based on the larger number, not just including schizophrenia. I'd like to just seek a little bit of feedback from folks on the phone, since we are a small group, about what is your impression today of what happens if someone in Wyoming develops psychosis. Sandy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually work more with the developmentally disabled and have not worked a great deal with the adolescents. I'm fairly new to Wyoming, so I'm hoping to learn.
Okay, great. And how about Patty or Rob? Do you guys have any experience with that you can share?
This is Patty. Just what experience I have, I'm not in a therapist role or anything, but I do interact with a lot of people here. You know, a lot of times when we have somebody that's in psychosis, it ends up in a crisis situation, and so they end up going to the hospital, and you're right, they end up going and being put in under involuntarily because sometimes they're not safe to be out. And then it is kind of that revolving door of, you know, maybe people don't understand it, and so we keep them kind of locked down until they're safe again. And so I think more education could definitely help keep people like that in our communities, and we could surround them with care better.
I would agree with that. I think what happens, at least in Casper, is in most of those instances, they could be transported by the police to the hospital, and then at the hospital be referred to WPI.
Okay, yeah, so there's definitely that sense that there's kind of a revolving door and a lot of involuntary and kind of traumatizing experiences, it sounds like.
This is Maggie.
I think,
I have a question. Relative to the previous slide that you had shown with some of the statistical information about Wyoming, I'm curious to know if any of your data actually identifies like a median age of these individuals or any kind of demographic like that.
Yeah, you know, so the typical age is younger for males than for females. In our experience, most of the people who are referred to us are in their kind of early 20s, but it goes as low as middle school. And as we get better at early identification, we're starting to see those symptoms much earlier on. So the data suggests that it would be in the early 20s, but when you actually start interviewing people about their experience, you start to discover that sometimes they've been having hallucinations as early as 7th grade, and so that's part of what we're trying to get to them much, much sooner.
Right. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
I was just going to say, I think there's a little bit of noise on the line, so again, if folks could mute when they're not speaking, that'd be great. So Maggie, did you have another question?
I did. Well, more of a comment. I think the only other piece that I would like to add to that conversation is that I think too frequently folks are identified by law enforcement because for some reason they may be behaviorally acting out in the community, and perhaps, you know, their behavior is taken as defiance rather than illness. And so I think all too frequently a lot of these individuals may end up in the criminal justice system as well as, you know, prior to an involuntary commitment,
Right.
all too frequently as well.
Right. Thank you for adding that, because that's definitely something that happens very frequently. Right?
Maggie, I just wanted to piggyback on that for just a minute. This is Patty in Douglas. We have recently been working with our prevention management here in Douglas and with our police department here. Officer Schmidt has been CIT trained, crisis intervention trained. And it is amazing some of the conversations we've gotten into with people that work with mental health and people that work on the law enforcement side. There's two totally different ideas there. Officer Schmidt, however, is kind of that person in the middle, and he's really bringing things together, and we're working really hard on getting a crisis intervention team here in town. And we're going to be having a training in May and July for that. So if surrounding areas are interested, I could definitely get information out to you for that.
That's awesome. That makes my heart happy, Patty.
That's great, and I think that's one of those examples of things that are already happening that could make a really huge difference, and the more people can pool their resources, the better. So Ryan, you want to pick this one up?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're starting to kind of hit on those kind of key reasons why we would want to intervene early with psychosis. Not only are these devastating consequences that we've already been talking about, this revolving door of the hospital, potential law enforcement. There's another key thing that's kind of happening at the time that psychosis, at least psychosis related to schizophrenia, when psychosis related to schizophrenia strikes, and that's when it happens during those key developmental years, especially when it comes to adolescence. We know that, if we believe Eric Erickson, that adolescence is a time of identity development, a time when we really try to concrete our identity and kind of move forward in the next stage of our life, that next stage being kind of young adulthood and ultimately into adulthood. If this identity goes well, we tend to be successful as adults. If it doesn't, then we potentially can struggle. One goal of an early psychosis program is that we work hard to try to curb that identity, to not send a message to young people who are experiencing these symptoms that they're going to have the identity of a mental health patient. But in fact, we want to continue to support their normal developmental processes, which means that we do a lot more focusing on working on independence, working on adult roles, working on relationships. I would say talked about identity development, and that vocational educational development. A lot of emphasis on helping people complete high school, graduate from high school, and or move on to college if that is their choice. And I think a lot of people see ESA, so a lot of the participants in ESA programs, science and ESA programs, see ESA as more of a vocational educational program than a mental health program, because in terms of identity, that's where young people's goals are. They usually don't come into a mental health system saying, "Yeah, you know what, I'm psychotic and I'd really like to take, grams of Zyprexa, and that's my goal." It's not usually the message that you get. The message you get is that I want to have a partner, I want to go to college, I want to graduate from high school, I want to get a job, I want to hang out with my friends. And so we really have to kind of shift our work that supports that ongoing identity development, and not send a message that unfortunately a lot of young people get now, which is, you have this illness called schizophrenia, you're going to have to take medicines your whole life, and here's your application for supplemental security disability. Very, very important. I think we have a real opportunity with these programs to curb identity and send a different message to young people experiencing these symptoms. One thing with psychosis, and I'm going to get into this a lot more in the next webinar when I talk about just kind of early warning signs and differential diagnosis. But one thing we do know about psychosis, in short, is it doesn't usually occur acutely. Like, you don't wake up psychotic. If you do, we would probably be looking at a drug-induced or something else. It's probably not schizophrenia. The psychosis that early psychosis programs are looking for, the schizophrenia-related psychosis, usually occurs in some form of an insidious pattern. I mean, there's a gradual onset. And so generally what we'll see around puberty is some cognitive changes. And what that looks like is that people might have trouble working in school. Things that they normally would do okay at or do well at, they're not able to do as well. And they don't know why, and it's quite frustrating for individuals. Talking to individuals who experience this, they would make statements like, "I just feel stupid, and I don't know why. I can't do this anymore." Or, "This is a lot harder than it used to be." It kind of starts out like that. That ultimately starts to transition to affective or mood changes, which actually might be early negative symptoms of psychosis. We generally know that with schizophrenia-related psychosis, negative precede positive symptoms. As these affective changes develop or continue to grow, social withdrawal occurs. People start to isolate from their peers, their family, their goals, and as that's happening, They get a lot of external pressure. Why aren't you doing what you used to do? Why aren't you going to school? Why aren't you getting your homework done? They actually believe that it's this that kind of starts triggering the onset of those positive symptoms. And that's those early positive symptoms is generally where early psychosis programs start connecting with people. Obviously, we'd love to catch people even earlier, and in some cases we can, but it's usually that onset of those early positive symptoms that we're able to catch people and start the intervention.
Unfortunately, even after that point where those acute symptoms come on and people are really having very obvious kinds of symptomology where they've begun to lose touch with reality, the average duration that people go before they receive any care in the United States is more than a year. The RAISE study, which was recently completed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, found that the folks that they served had an average of 74 weeks of having gone without any treatment. And we know that there's a lot of research that has been going on going back into the 80s, looking at the impact of delay on outcomes, and there are now some good 10-year studies out there that are showing that if you get to somebody within the first couple of months, that you can have really significant effects on symptom severity, rates of remission, social functioning, quality of life, and those changes or those differences persist over an extended period. So you guys talked about that cycle that is very, very common in communities, and I often will equate it to an issue of accommodations. If you think about psychosis, where people are losing their ability to connect point A to point C, and we're asking them to find their way to a mental health center, acknowledge that they have an illness that needs treatment, and to show up at the same time that not only are they experiencing psychosis, but they're a teenager or a young adult, and they have to have the right insurance on top of it. We create so many barriers for people, and I kind of equate it to if we set up a system of care that was designed to serve people in wheelchairs, ostensibly, and we put it on the second story without an elevator and without a ramp, and we didn't do any outreach, we probably wouldn't have a lot of folks in wheelchairs coming to us, and we'd probably be seeing them in the emergency room because they're not able to get their needs met, and eventually somebody finds them in an acute medical state. So our families are very, very familiar with the term, there's nothing we can do until the person is an imminent threat to themselves or others. So, quite often these families have actually been seeking help for quite a while and getting that kind of a response where their young person may not be quite ready to seek treatment. The family knows that they need it desperately, but they interface with systems that tell them that they have to be at a level of dangerousness, and then they'll put them in handcuffs and force them into treatment in a way that is traumatizing. And then once they come in, then people are so used to seeing that high level of acuity, and they're so used to things not going well, that there's almost an assumption that things are going to continue to not go well. So a typical thing that people experience is that they might come into the emergency room and somebody tells them, you have schizophrenia, that means that you'll have to take this medicine, you'll have to probably take it for the rest of your life, you might not be able to work, or you're going to have to really, really scale things back. And so not only do they hear these words that are very, very powerful to them that might have negative connotations, but also they're given specific messages that there are things you're not going to be able to do. And at the age of 19 or 20, or 15, those are messages that are extremely powerful and can have very significant long-term consequences. So, and then the other thing that we know is that the care that is available in our communities typically is not based on the evidence. It's not. It's based on what's funded, and so there are issues with how much service is available, what type of service, what kind of training folks have received, and so that could reinforces the pathology, and so people end up in this cycle that is kind of in some ways generated by the system itself, as well as the condition. And the impact of that is really tremendous. And I think as a society, we're starting to really kind of recognize some of the consequences and to try to do something about it. In 2002 alone, we spent over $62 billion on schizophrenia specifically, and we know it has huge impacts on unemployment. Schizophrenia is one of the highest causes of disability in the age group of 15 to 44. There are, I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with some of the life expectancy studies that have been done that have identified that there's a significant reduction in life expectancy. WHO talks about 10 years, but the figures go up as high as 25. People are at much greater risk of victimization, suicide, and the suicide risk actually is the highest right at that point of onset, right towards the beginning. So if we don't get to people sooner, not only may they have a really bad trajectory, but they might actually not make it to the next year. And of course, homelessness is a big issue as well. So this is kind of a dense slide, but just to let you know that there has been a lot going on to try to understand what people need. So understanding the course of the illness and then also understanding how to intervene. So when we started back in 2001, there were a bunch of universities that had been doing research. Most of those universities had discovered all kinds of things that had not been translated to the community. And there's one study in particular to kind of keep your eye out for called the North American Prodromal Longitudinal Study, or NAPLES. That's a coalition of 12 universities around the United States and Canada that have been pooling their data over time, and they're looking specifically at the onset of schizophrenia. So they are looking at those early symptoms that Ryan was talking about and how to actually identify those, how to predict who's actually going to develop schizophrenia, and they've had a lot of success with that, and they actually have a new study that's about to come out where they'll be talking about, they've actually gotten to the point where they're able to predict onset with much greater accuracy. There are programs around the country that have been doing this for a while. So when we came on board in 2001, there was a program on Long Island in New York called Hillside Hospital. And when you hear about the RAISE studies, you might hear about Delbert Robinson and John Kane. Those two guys were at Hillside Hospital and have been doing this work for a long time. The University of North Carolina OASIS program is one of our partners, and they've been doing it for many, many years. Lots of programs in California. Yale has done some work in this field, and then when we started as a first episode program, the Portland Identification and Early Referral Service in Portland, Maine, or PURE, was also focusing on the psychosis risk syndrome, or those folks who are prior to onset. So their experience has focused on people who hadn't actually developed psychosis but looked like they were in the process, whereas we started out with psychosis specifically and then started doing psychosis risk syndrome later on. PURE and EASA were part of a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation study called EDIP, or the Early Detection and Intervention for the Prevention of Psychosis. And that was looking at that if there's a way to prevent the onset and also responding to very, very early first episode. The RAISE study, which you'll hear a lot about because they have, they've gotten a lot of national visibility. They were funded by NIMH. They've produced a lot of materials that are available online that you guys can access really easily. So that RAISE included 2 specific arms. One arm was called the Early Treatment Program, and that it translates into the name of Navigate. So when you hear about Navigate, you're hearing about the research study that NIMH funded. So what the Early Treatment Program, or Navigate, did is they created a manualized set of treatments that they trained mental health centers to do. They randomized mental health centers across the country, and then they had the different. They had half of them implement the manualized treatment, and the results have just recently come out and look quite favorable. So there's a lot of support available to help kind of implement some of those methods. RAISE Connections was funded through Columbia University. It was done with the state of New York and Maryland, and their focus was on trying to develop materials that local communities could use to help get programs started. All of these programs were done primarily in urban areas, but not entirely. So there are definitely ways of translating them. And the RAISE Connections program is by the name of Track on New York, but there's also On Track. Those who are really interested, the International Early Psychosis Association has a free membership, and they have a conference every other year. This year it's going to be in Milan, so if anyone is really interested, in October there's an opportunity to go to Italy and learn more. And as I said, there's been a lot going on internationally, particularly in the Commonwealth countries. So Australia, New Zealand, England, Canada all have national implementation going on. And then quite a few Asian countries nowadays as well have started. Ari talked a little bit about the mental health block grant set aside. That came as a result of bipartisan congressional action in 2014, and then they've just recently expanded their commitment to from 5% to 10%. They've actually increased the amount of money coming to the states rather than just telling people that they need to do it. And they have funded a great deal of technical assistance and development of written materials. So there's all kinds of stuff available out there for people to just pick up and read and implement. A couple of really important things. We just recently created an organization called the Prodrome and Early Psychosis Prevention Network, or PEPNet. That is a national membership organization. It's free. It's a place where people doing early psychosis work are all trying to come together to share our knowledge and to help move forward. There's another organization called Partners for Strong Minds, which is a national attempt to get the word out there about early psychosis. And we are at a point where I think we started 16 programs back in 2013 or 2014, and we are now at over 120. That this slide says 100, but it's actually closer to 120. In terms of national support, there's a document that is kind of considered a core document. It's online. It's written by some folks at NIMH, and they're referring to some of the early findings from RAISE, but also kind of the depth of the research and the breadth of the research that's out there. And basically what they've said is that the research is so compelling that the question is not whether early intervention works for first episode psychosis, but how to get these programs available in community settings everywhere in the country. And I've actually had a conversation with Bob Heinsohn, who is at NIMH, about conversations happening at the national level, literally trying to price out what it would take to make these programs available in every community. So there's an unprecedented amount of commitment at the national level right now. Okay, Ryan?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we've got a really nice history, and talk about the reasons for early psychosis programs and the history and the current research happening on early psychosis programs, as well as the evidence for early psychosis programs. So I get to answer the question of, well, what do these programs do? And what is this coordinated specialty care in early psychosis? What does that look like? Again, in later webinars, I will get into more specifics on the evidence-based practices and the treatments. But in general, and for the purposes of today's webinar, they are integrated teams that obviously serve teenagers and young adults with early symptoms of true psychosis. Integrated means that there's several disciplines working together on a frequent basis, talking about all the clients in the program. Frequency could be, most of the programs in Oregon meet once a week, some meet twice a week, just to kind of to talk about what's happening this week with these individual clients. Not necessarily spending a whole lot of time on processing, but action steps, what's next, what do we got to do, so quite intensive level of service. Follow ACT, assertive community treatment level of care with these programs. So across the team, it's your client to staff ratio should be about 10 to 1. It integrates a wide range of disciplines, your medical prescribers, clinical services, which can look like counselors and case management. We recommend that both of those be present. Clearly, supported employment and supported education is necessary for these programs. Peer support is an emerging practice that's getting a lot of attention, and we're finding in Oregon to be quite helpful. And then not only peer support at the client level, but family support. In Oregon, we integrate Bill McFarland's multifamily group support education model. Certainly, these programs only work if people know about us, so time needs to be set aside within these programs for your staff to educate the community about these programs. And you can't do prevention if people don't know to call you when they see these early warning signs. So that means you're getting out to doctors' offices, churches, schools, crisis centers, emergency rooms, letting them know that you exist. And then once you get that call, sometimes you get that call when somebody's in the midst of an early psychotic episode, and as Tamara said, these are not going to be individuals that are going to necessarily willingly walk right into your office. We're going to have to accommodate for the symptoms of the condition. We're going to have to go to them, and we're going to have to spend some time trying to engage them versus coming right in with our packets of paper and assessments to fill out, particularly individuals who have started to reach that threshold of a first true episode of psychosis. Again, going back to the definition of psychosis, that means that people are kind of losing touch with reality. So I think it would be unreasonable to expect that they would then accept treatment. So we have to engage them in treatment before we can expect them to accept treatment. Obviously, having good connections with your crisis teams being aware of your program so they can get to you rapidly and you can get to them rapidly. And then, as I mentioned early, the treatment really focused on the individual's strengths, their goals, and consistent with their developmental stage. So again, coming in strongly with you need to accept this condition generally isn't as effective as, I'm here to help you, get back into college or to pass that math class. Yeah, and again, these are programs that generally these are individuals who have intact family or at the very least intact social supports in almost all cases. We've seen that in Oregon. Almost everybody has involved families. If they don't have involved biological families, they've got involved social systems. So part of the care is keeping those social systems intact. And one way we do that is through the multifamily group model. Other ways is outreach to families, outreach providing education, And in some cases, outreaching to the family, even when the individual is not at a point where they're willing to understand what's happening to them. So we might spend a lot of time just providing triage, crisis resources, and education to families, even when the individual won't talk to us. And
Ryan, excuse me, this is Jenny.
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah. I think we've got a new participant, and Brandon, if you're able, would you please mute your phone? All right, I muted it for him.
Okay, thank you.
I do apologize. I'm sorry.
You might want to go back to the prescribing discussion.
Yeah, I was going to start there. It's a nice kind of example of what someone with psychosis might be experiencing, a lot of interference, and kind of have to work through that. So the difficulty that you were all having understanding me might be what somebody who's psychosis is experiencing, which means what do we have to do? We have to go back and repeat, spend time engaging, and making accommodations. But yeah, so when it comes to prescribing, again, the mantra is start low in terms of dosing and move slow, particularly with individuals in the early symptoms of psychosis. Again, they're going to experience the side effects of these medicines likely before they experience the benefit of those medicines. So being very kind of careful in terms of monitoring, as well as talking about side effects. Obviously, some of the primary therapy models that early psychosis programs use, motivational interviewing, you probably understand why that intervention would be used, primarily because people will lack kind of some motivation to get treatment. And particularly, we also know there's a high rate of substance use disorders with the population, so definitely generally not this. They generally will follow not pre-contemplative, not really seen as a problem. So MI is a necessary skill set for clinicians working this program. And obviously there's a good evidence base for cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy with psychosis. So want to have that skill set as well. Again, that is a model that you would integrate with somebody who is probably a little bit further along, maybe not someone who is acutely psychotic. If someone's acutely psychotic, then you're going to be focusing more on crisis intervention, family education, and engagement. And obviously, I've talked about this enough, so I hope that that's clear, that this big emphasis on ongoing support for school, work, relationships. And then, yeah, this kind of seeing every person that comes to your program as an asset, as that their experience is a valuable experience, and they're going to be your greatest teachers. We've also done some integration of feedback-informed treatment. I don't know if people are familiar with that, and I might talk about that in a later webinar, but it's a treatment that generally focuses on getting direct feedback from your participants or from your clients to learn whether or not your intervention is helpful both at an outcome level, and that be their outcomes, not necessarily your outcomes, and at a relationship level. So it's really a cool model that transcends all sorts of therapeutic interventions. So we've been doing some integration of that as well.
Okay, so beginning to translate this, and like Ryan said, we're going to be talking in much greater depth about a lot of this material, and also we'll have time to answer questions and that kind of thing. But as we think about a rural community or a community that might not have as much resource as would be ideal, or just the fact that we have professionals who haven't necessarily been trained in some of these methods, what are some of the things that we can do? And for sure, one thing is just looking at where our existing strengths lie. So the conversation that we started having around CIT earlier is a great example where if we can get law enforcement responding differently, then that will help us to both identify earlier and then also respond faster and more proactively. There are things that we can do just around trying to reduce our barriers. So, for example, we all talk about priority population, or who has priority access to care. Just integrating psychosis automatically as someone who has more rapid access. Looking at procedures that you could follow that might be different for someone who is experiencing psychosis. looking at what's available in your community, whether it's kind of online support or community college support, and trying to really work together with those folks. Bringing families in as partners from the beginning. If there are family advocacy groups like NAMI, is there a way to work with them? And then looking at how can we start to train professionals generally in some of these practices that we know work, and trying to do it a little bit more systematically, where maybe it's not just for the early psychosis program, maybe it's a broader training that incorporates motivational interviewing or supported employment, and trying to make those things available. And then again, learning from what's out there. So there's a lot that's been developed that doesn't have to be recreated, that you can just kind of pull up. So I guess this leads into a little bit more of a discussion about who in Wyoming is going to be the most concerned about these issues. So you guys were talking about this revolving door that's happening. What's your sense of who the stakeholders might be that would be particularly interested? And also, are there folks who might be kind of natural leaders in this area who are particularly affected? And I think we'll come back to these questions in just a sec. But these are some of the things that we'll want to think about together. Also thinking about, are there services that are already out there, educational efforts that you can build on, where you can just add to them or reinforce them. This is our we're going to encourage everybody to join us online, and then we have these national resources. But I guess I'm interested in having a conversation with you, both about questions that you still have, and then also kind of your thoughts about any kind of answers that come to mind to some of these questions. And with that, we're just going to open it up for conversation.
This is Rob. I think there's been a lot of discussion within communities and at the legislative level related to Title 25 and involuntary hospitalizations and that kind of thing. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what has been finalized there. I think the behavioral health program has taken a lot of leadership and advocacy in this area. And I think there have been a lot of discussions between NAMI and others related to it, so I think that's good. I think their CIT training is being pushed out statewide through the Prevention Management Organization and local police departments, and so I think, and NAMI, and so I think that's going to be very helpful in the long run. But I think we still have a lot of gaps.
That's great. So yeah, if we think about who's involved in those efforts, one of the things that's been really helpful in Oregon is connecting some of those areas where there's already momentum and people recognize the need. And the one thing with this population is that they tend to go straight to the hospital, and then they tend to go back to the hospital repeatedly and get in trouble with the law. So they probably are costing the state more than other folks who are coming into the mental health system. Plus, there's the awareness that there's a problem. So thank you, Rob. I think if we can think about who some of those folks are that are involved. I don't think we have anybody from NAMI on the line today. But there's actually a national NAMI learning collaborative around this issue. So maybe there's a way that we can help kind of connect those dots. Yeah, great. And so for folks on the line, if you have specific ideas about people that should be pulled into the conversation, maybe if you could send. Ari, does everybody have your email?
I believe so. If not, I can give it to you. It's aurie.garcia@wyo.gov. probably, having some people from the school district or maybe our Department of Education would be helpful.
Ari, this is Rob.
Okay.
Even though they're probably not eligible for any of the funding of it, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work with Wyoming Behavioral Institute and Wyoming Medical Center on some of these areas. Are they invited to participate in these conversations?
Oh, absolutely. I sent out invitations to as many emails and addresses that I had, but if you would like, you can forward. This is open to anybody in the community.
Okay, I may forward it to a couple of people and just say, this is very helpful and we need you.
That's fantastic. That's exactly how this is going to start to take hold, is those personal relationships and just recognizing that there's a problem that really needs to be addressed. Are there other suggestions or questions that folks on the line have?
This is Patty in Douglas, and I just have a comment that sitting in on this really makes sense to me. We've been working with our legislators here. Eric Barlow has been somebody really strong on the Title 25. He was on the subcommittee. He actually came to our facility. We met about that and his frustrations, and he actually has a family member that's been through this process, so it's pretty near and dear to his heart. And we've been working, like I said, with law enforcement and all of that, and I really feel like when I've met with different groups of people, being in the mental health world, and I have somebody in my family that struggles with mental health issues, so for me, it's not different. I understand, I guess, more about it. But when you run across people that maybe haven't had experience, or, in law enforcement, maybe they do see people as a criminal and not necessarily having a mental health disorder, I think that the big piece is getting people educated and giving them resources so that we can take care of these people in our own community, so that the cost of sending them out, to these inpatient hospitals cuts back a lot, and we can really, I think, start educating people in our own communities.
That's great, and I think the point that you just made about how this affects people is really important, because we found out as well that there have been a lot of people in decision-making positions who have had direct experience. In fact, I have had so many phone calls from funders and other people who, once they were introduced to our program, started calling and asking for advice about what to do about their relatives. So I think there's actually a lot of knowledge out there, and I think that there's also an opportunity to start, bringing in folks with lived experience who can talk about how much of an effect it has. We have a really wonderful young adult leadership council of folks who have been through our program, and they've taken on the mantle of trying to articulate the importance of early intervention, as well as trying to be there for folks who are newer to the experience. So the more we can tap into people who have actually had a successful outcome, that starts to create its own momentum. Because when I was involved in the legislature, before we started EASA, we had all these really terrible horror stories about things that had happened to people, and everybody was kind of depressed, and then we started the program, and we were able to bring people who had been part of it to the legislature, and the stories changed it in a really profound way, where all of a sudden, instead of talking about being put out in the street, barefoot, they were talking about going back to college and kind of what their plans were, and it was just incredible shift. And the thing that's so interesting about it is that the young adults themselves have become really important advocates. In fact, their biggest issue is that they think we should be identifying people earlier and more systematically. So it's been really interesting to see this change in Oregon, and it's interesting. Our young adults are so excited about the national work that's happening, and so they're really interested in supporting other states. So if there were ever an opportunity where, I'm sure you guys have folks within Wyoming who are in successful recovery, and those would be the first folks to tap into. But then we also have these young adults who would would absolutely adore the opportunity to help you, to offer kind of an alternative scenario for the future. Any other thoughts or questions? We have till 10:30.
Yeah, this is Dr. Jensen with behavioral health. It seems like, from my point of view, we have a lot of providers in Wyoming that are scared to take on clients with developmental disabilities. In some ways, they aren't different. In some ways, it is very different. I've seen clients misdiagnosed, they're having normal self-talk, and if you ask them, are they hearing voices, they'll say yes, and they get a diagnosis of psychosis. But I would love to see our providers get more involved and get comfortable with treating that population.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that's definitely an area where it would be good for us to have more conversation about what the appropriate treatment is, because a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapy and other methods that are being used don't work as well with folks with developmental disabilities. But what you're talking about in terms of the misdiagnosis is definitely very, very common, and so that might be a conversation that we want to continue to talk about. How do you promote appropriate diagnosis, and then also encourage the local community to be, to have or provide the resources for the local community so that they feel comfortable serving the folks who come through the door. Most of our early psychosis programs actually don't accept people with an IQ under 70, but they provide consultation and support to folks who are working with folks with developmental disabilities. But you guys may want to think about that in a different kind of way as well.
Hello, this is Jessie Westling with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Ombudsman Program.
Great.
And, when we look at our Title 25 data that's been presented to the state, it says that, a lot of the majority of individuals who are Title 25 are not associated with a community mental health center. And so I'm thinking, how do we get those individuals connected either when they're getting discharged out of, one of our psychiatric hospitals, or how do we get them connected before they have to go into, a psychiatric hospital? I think that's kind of one of the key pieces the data is showing us, is that we're missing that connection between the local community mental health center and the individuals who are experiencing, this crisis.
That's really important data, and also really important point that that continuity of care is a huge issue. And we one of the things that we ask our teams to do is that they're doing outreach to hospitals, particularly at that early stage where if somebody's identified while they're in a hospital, our teams actually go to them in order to create a relationship before they're discharged. Because what we found is that if they don't do that, that the chances of us ever seeing them again before they have another crisis are not that great. And the other piece of that is connecting the family to education and support even while the person is in the hospital, so that they're better prepared to help facilitate that discharge. So we're beginning to identify what some of those key elements are going to be in Wyoming. So this all the work around Title 25, some of the work around how do we integrate services and support communities, CIT, the family members that are out there. Great, this is a really wonderful conversation. Other comments or questions before we call it a week, and we'll be reconvening again next week to talk more about differential diagnosis.
I was just going to add, when we were in conversation with Eric Barlow, he had talked about working on the bill in regards to Title 25 and having a piece in there that states about follow-up care, what's requested. And I know a lot of our problems is people that are held on the Title 25, we send them to WBI and Casper, and then a lot of times they're released and we don't get discharge paperwork or any notice that they're coming out, and so they'll come back into our community, and then within a month or two they're back in crisis when we didn't know that they were here, where we could have surrounded them with services and hopefully kept them out of inpatient treatment. So I just think that link needs to be a little stronger, and so I think with that piece, hopefully getting put in the bill will help that a lot.
Yeah, that's a really great idea, and it's a good example of a simple thing that actually is really just about communication and less so about resources. The other thing is, if you've got legislation, being strategic around having something about early psychosis inserted in that legislation can be really helpful. That's how we got our state funding. We had to rebuild our state hospital, and they wrote a master plan for what they were going to do, and they included a paragraph in there about how we had to have effective community services available, and then it said such as, and it listed our program, and that got the legislature familiar, got them seeing it as a solution, and then ultimately they ended up funding it. So the more you can kind of strategically insert things, that it kind of lays the groundwork. So, other questions or things that you'd like to learn more about as we go through the next webinars, opportunities you want to share with each other?
I think just continuing the dialogue is helpful. I think for me at least, some of it is a major learning curve. So thank you.
Yeah, you bet. That's one thing about this work is that it's a huge learning curve, and we view it as a developmental process, both at the individual and at the systemic level. So if we can get clear, and that you'll never stop learning. I'd like to say the learning curve has gotten less steep, but for me it just continues to grow, and I've been doing it for 15 years. But you start to see that feedback about, oh, this is working. People are actually having a positive experience, and it's making a difference. So it gives you feedback that, okay, we are headed in the right direction. So it's very fun work to be involved in, because you do see results, and you start to see these young people who are having different kinds of outcomes and becoming engaged in a different kind of way. And they end up being partners with you down the road in what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm really excited that we have such a good group of people who are interested in this, and that I feel really hopeful that you guys are gonna do something really cool. Any other thoughts or questions, requests for our future webinars?
This is Ari. I just encourage everybody to forward these invitations to as many people as you can. The more people that we have on the webinar presentation, the better. And so if you can think of anybody that you could forward these to, or even send me email addresses, I'll be happy to forward it out to more people as well. So.
Great. Okay. Anything else before we head out? Ryan, you want to add anything?
No. I think it's a great starting point, and look forward to continuing the conversation and to get into more of the specifics. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us this morning. Questions?
This is Patty from.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just let you know. Please feel free to use our emails and contact us, or use our website, and follow us on Facebook. We have that too. We post a lot of information there.
So, Patty?
Yes, I just had a question, and this might be a silly question, but I kind of got thrown on this webinar not knowing what I was getting on today. But I'm glad I did, because it was a great conversation. So the next webinars are going to be just kind of digging into that piece and finding out what's working, what's not for people, in hopes of a grant in FY17 to maybe cover outreach and education to people within our communities. Is that the goal?
Well, I think Ari is about to talk about the funding question. There's some funding that's out there that Ari can talk about, but in terms of the series, we were going to talk in the next conversation, we were going to talk specifically about early identification. So that, that starts to get into what kind of community education you might do, what you're looking for, the differential diagnosis issues. And then we'll talk more about the actual clinical practices on the February 18th call. And then on the 25th, we'll try to kind of wrap things up and really talk about how can Wyoming start to integrate this stuff, and how do you start building a system that actually begins to make sense? So, Ari, do you want to add?
Yeah, this is Ari. So with our mental health block grant, we do have the award that will be awarded to one program, and that is going to be awarded for the July 2016 contracts that are being, providers are currently applying for those. So that award will actually be in those contracts, which I believe they're the FY17. And then we will receive another block grant award starting in October of ending in September of 2017. At that point, there will be another, hopefully a increased amount that we would put into it would go in the first 3 months of the FY18 contracts. So there's kind of a timeline that we have, but either way, for the July of this year, there will be the first award going to that program, to whoever is selected after the application process.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Jenny. I have a comment also. Excuse me. When the webinar is finished, the attendees will receive a survey to give feedback on this. And the last section includes an option to write your opinions, thoughts, suggestions. And I do encourage you to fill that so that we can really keep tailoring the webinars to our audience. And also, if you run out of space on that little area that you've got in the survey, do feel free to email any of us, and we will make sure that the information is coming from the right people.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Are there any other last-minute questions or comments before we send everybody out into the snow, right? You guys probably have a fair amount of snow right now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Somewhat. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I would like to thank Tamara and Ryan for their invaluable information. We can't wait for the next one. It'll be same time next Thursday, where we're going to be talking about learning about the early signs of psychosis. Until then, feel free to email me. My email is jallen@witchy.edu, or any of the other presenters that were on this morning. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, Tamara, Ryan, Ari, would you like to say farewell?
Thanks, everybody. This has been great.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, and I'll sign off.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.